If you love Miss Marple-style village puzzles, subscribe to Shadowed Pages and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. The snow had been falling since before dawn, smoothing St. Mary Mead into something almost theatrical: white hedgerows, white roofs, and a silence so complete it felt staged for a Christmas card. By mid-morning the lane to Frozen Cottage was nearly swallowed, its crooked chimney puffing a thin ribbon of smoke like a polite apology for existing at all. Inside the vicarage, the kettles sang, and the villagers did what they always did during bad weather. They invented errands. A tin of biscuits needed fetching, a shawl needed mending, a neighbor required checking upon with great urgency and very little evidence. Miss Marple sat near the fire with her knitting balanced neatly on her knees, watching the window as though it were a television set that only ever played human nature. She had been told twice that Frozen Cottage was empty this season. Shut up. Key left with the estate agent. No one expected until spring. So when the front door of Frozen Cottage creaked open just a fraction, as if breathed upon, Miss Marple's needles paused. She said nothing at first. She rarely did. She simply watched, the way one watched a dog in a lane or a child near a pond, not alarmed exactly, but attentive. Then young Mrs. Pritchard came skidding back down the lane, face the color of skim milk, arms flailing as she tried to keep her balance on the glassy ruts. Her wool hat had slipped sideways, and a lock of hair clung damply to her forehead. She seemed not to notice. She was staring behind her as if the cottage had grown teeth. "There's someone inside," she cried, breath bursting in white clouds. "Someone lying on the floor. Oh, I nearly fainted, I did." Mrs. Pritchard was the sort of woman who said such things in advance, as though fainting were an accomplishment she had narrowly missed. But her voice now had a thinness to it that made even the vicar's wife set down her cup. Dr. Haydock had been summoned to many things in St. Mary Mead, but never with quite such speed. He arrived in his heavy coat and scarf, cheeks reddened from the cold, and his expression wore that familiar mixture of annoyance and professional duty, as though death were inconvenient to his schedule, but he would endure it because it was his trade. The vicar, Mr. Clement, had insisted on coming as well, murmuring something about spiritual comfort, though Miss Marple had noticed that his eyes had brightened with a curiosity he would have been ashamed to admit. Mrs. Clement followed with the air of someone who disliked drama but could not bear to miss it. And of course, where the vicar went, at least 3 respectable ladies felt it was their Christian responsibility to drift in his wake. Miss Marple rose quietly and wrapped her scarf about her neck. No one asked her to come. No one ever did. Yet she moved with them, a small figure among taller bodies, her boots sensible, her handbag held neatly in one gloved hand, and her knitting tucked away as though it were no more than an afterthought. "Now, Mrs. Pritchard," Dr. Haydock said briskly as they reached the bend where Frozen Cottage crouched behind its hedge of holly, "tell me exactly what you saw. No embellishment." "I was only going to leave a little jar of gooseberry jam," Mrs. Pritchard said, as if offering jam were a noble calling, "because poor Mr. Dane said no one's been there, and it seemed a shame, such a lonely place. And I thought, well, if I just tuck it by the step." "You went up to the door," the doctor prompted. "Yes." "And I saw, it was open a little, just a crack, which frightened me because it's supposed to be locked. So I thought perhaps the estate agent had come, or some workman, and I said, 'Hello?' and no one answered. So I pushed it just a little, mind, and the smell came out." "What smell?" Mrs. Clement asked, though her tones suggested she already knew. Mrs. Pritchard swallowed, cold, and something metallic, like pennies. "I don't know why I thought that, but I did." Miss Marple's gaze flicked to the snow at the foot of the cottage steps. It lay pristine and thick, unbroken except for Mrs. Pritchard's frantic, skidding tracks that began halfway down the lane and ended at the bottom of the step, as though she had not been steady enough to place her feet neatly. There were no other marks, no careful soles, no heavy boots, no dragging, nothing that led to the threshold, nothing that led away. "Perhaps the wind pushed it open," Mr. Clement began, anxious to supply a harmless explanation. "In this weather?" Dr. Haydock said, and snorted. He went up the step and tested the door with a gloved hand. It moved inward with a soft complaint. "Not latched properly," he muttered, and then, very quietly, "Stay behind me." They went in. The air inside was indeed cold, but not the clean cold of an empty house. It carried that faint, sour tang of something that should not have been left. The hallway was narrow, panelled in dark wood that drank what little daylight slipped through the frosted glass. A coat stand leaned at an angle, and a pair of boots sat by the wall, as if someone had stepped out of them in a hurry. "Boots," Miss Marple murmured, barely audible, and then stopped herself, as though it were not her place to remark. But her eyes lingered, measuring their size, their shape, their wear. The sitting-room door was ajar. Dr. Haydock pushed it open with his shoulder. There, by the hearth where no fire burned, lay a man. He was face down, one arm bent awkwardly beneath him, fingers curled as if they had tried to clutch at the rug. His coat was still on. His hair, dark and neatly cut, had been dusted with tiny white flecks of snow that must have blown in at some point, settling on him with a strange gentleness. A small side table had been knocked askew, and beside it a teacup lay shattered, the tea dried into a brown, sticky stain. Mrs. Pritchard gave a sound that might have been a sob or might have been an announcement. Dr. Haydock knelt, his movement suddenly efficient. He pressed his fingers to the man's neck, then shifted to check his wrist, then sat back on his heels. "Yes," he said shortly. "Quite." Mrs. Clement's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Clement closed his eyes as if the sight required prayer. One of the ladies behind them whispered, "Good heavens," not in devotion but in relish. Miss Marple did not move closer. She had learned long ago that people resented an old woman's nearness to tragedy, unless she was carrying a casserole. She stayed near the doorway, her face mild, her eyes soft, and yet she saw everything. The way the man's left hand was splayed, but the right curl tighter, the broken cup, but no matching saucer. The chair pulled out slightly from the table, angled as though someone had sat and risen abruptly. Dr. Haydock lifted the man's head carefully and turned it just enough to see the side of his face. There was a small, dark mark at the base of the skull, half hidden by hair, not a great wound, nothing dramatic, almost tidy. "He didn't fall like that from fainting," the doctor said low. "Not with that." Mr. Clement made a troubled sound. "Who is he?" Dr. Haydock's eyes narrowed as he examined the man's features more closely. "Not one of ours," he said. "I don't recognize him." "Then what was he doing here?" Mrs. Clement whispered, though the question was not aimed at anyone in particular. It hung in the cold air like breath. Miss Marple's gaze drifted again to the hall and the boots by the wall. They were damp along the edges, as if they had been worn recently, but there was no corresponding trail of melted snow. She noticed, too, the doormat by the door neat, brushed, as though someone had taken care to wipe their feet. A small domestic detail that felt oddly deliberate. Outside, the snow kept falling, as though the village had been placed under glass. Inside, with the dead man cooling by an unlit fire, Mary Mead began to rearrange itself around a new, irresistible certainty. Something had happened in frozen cottage that could not be explained away with weather, or accident, or ordinary misfortune, and Miss Marple, standing quietly with her handbag clasped in both hands, looked at the unbroken whiteness beyond the threshold and thought, with a faint tightening behind her eyes, that people were always so sure they could hide their tracks, until nature, or conscience, or a small overlooked detail made fools of them. The police arrived with the sound of engines straining against the snow, a noise that felt intrusive in a village accustomed to bicycles and polite footsteps. Sergeant Graves stepped out first, stamping his boots and surveying frozen cottage with an expression that suggested irritation more than concern. He had been stationed in St. Mary Mead long enough to believe he understood it, which was precisely why he disliked surprises. Behind him came Constable Wilkes, younger, earnest, and already looking faintly overwhelmed by the number of women gathered at a respectful yet determined distance. The villagers had arranged themselves instinctively, forming small knots of speculation that hummed with restrained excitement. Death, when it happened elsewhere, was tragic. When it happened here, It was narrative. Everyone wanted to know where they fit in the story. Sergeant Graves ducked into the cottage, nodded briskly to Dr. Haydock, and cast a quick glance at the body before straightening. "Name?" he asked. "Unknown," Dr. Haydock replied. "Male, late 40s perhaps. No obvious signs of illness. There's a blow to the back of the head, small but enough." Graves grimaced. "So not a slip on the rug, then?" "Hardly." Graves sighed, already tired. He turned, noticing Miss Marple standing just beyond the threshold, hands folded, eyes mild. He gave her the same nod he might have offered a sideboard. "We'll need statements. Everyone who came in." "Oh, of course," Miss Marple said pleasantly, stepping back as though she had never intended to be in the way. She watched as others bustled forward, eager to be useful, eager to be seen. Outside, Mrs. Pritchard was holding court, her earlier terror now burnished into authority. "I knew something was wrong the moment I saw that door," she was saying. "I always say you can feel these things. Intuition, that's what it is." Mrs. Bantry sniffed. "Intuition didn't stop you going inside." "Well, one can't be too careful," Mrs. Pritchard said, affronted. "And anyway, someone had to discover him." Miss Marple listened, head slightly tilted. She had heard the same tones countless times in village dramas and small the pride in being first, the relief of not being last. She noticed how Mrs. Bantry's eyes darted to the cottage windows, as though expecting movement there, and how Mrs. Pritchard clutched her handbag now with a firmness that suggested she was anchoring herself to something solid. Sergeant Graves emerged again, rubbing his hands together. "We'll be sealing the place for now, until we know who he is and how he came to be here. No one goes in or out." "But he's not from the village," Mrs. Bantry said at once. Dr. Haydock said so. "That's right," Graves replied, "which makes it more interesting." The word thrilled the air. Interesting. It suggested secrets imported from elsewhere, possibilities beyond the hedgerows. Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh. She had lived long enough to know that interesting was rarely pleasant. Later, at the vicarage, the kettle sang again, this time with urgency. The sitting room was crowded. Grief had not yet found its way in, leaving space for conjecture. Coats steamed gently near the fire, and cups were pressed into hands whether wanted or not. "He must have been a burglar," someone said. "Frozen Cottage has been empty for months. Easy target." "But nothing was taken," Mrs. Clement replied. "The furniture's old but valuable. That little walnut table alone. Perhaps he was disturbed," Mrs. Bantry suggested. "Caught in the act." "By whom?" Mrs. Pritchard demanded. "There were no footprints." I looked. Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly, watching the surface ripple and settle. "Snow can be very misleading," she said mildly. "It hides as much as it shows." Mrs. Pritchard frowned, unsure whether this was wisdom or contradiction. Dr. Haydock leaned back, arms folded. There was tea in the cup. "Recently poured. That suggests he was expected." "Expected?" Mrs. Clement echoed. "But by whom?" "No one's meant to be staying there." "No one local," Dr. Haydock said. The room absorbed this, turning it over like a stone. Miss Marple glanced toward the window. Outside, Constable Wilkes was pacing the edge of the garden, his boots finally leaving the first official marks in the snow. She wondered if he noticed how close he stayed to the fence, as though unwilling to commit himself to the open space. "And the boots?" she asked softly. Dr. Haydock looked at her. "What boots?" "In the hall," Miss Marple said, as though recalling an inconsequential detail. "By the wall. They looked as though they belonged to the gentleman, but they were neatly placed. Someone who intended to stay a while, perhaps." "That's true," Dr. Haydock said slowly. "He wouldn't have taken them off if he were just poking about." Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. "Then he was invited, or felt at home," Miss Marple added, smiling faintly. Sergeant Graves returned just then, stamping snow from his boots and removing his cap. "We found identification," he announced. "Wallet in his inside pocket. Name's Arthur Bell. Address in London." "A visitor," Mrs. Clement murmured, as though that explained everything. More than that, Graves went on, he was a solicitor. This caused a stir of a different quality. Solicitors belonged to a world of documents and consequences, of letters that arrived unexpectedly and changed lives. Miss Marple felt a small, familiar tightening in her chest. She had seen what happened when the past came calling with legal authority. "Any idea what he was doing here?" Dr. Haydock asked. Graves shook his head. "That's what we'll be finding out. He had no appointment noted, no luggage, just himself, a key that fits the front door, and a cup of tea he never finished." "A key?" Mrs. Pritchard cried. "But I was told everyone was told the key was with the estate agent." Graves met her gaze evenly. Apparently not the only one. The room seemed to contract around that thought. Keys implied access. Access implied trust. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant now, seeing not the vicarage, but another sitting room long ago, another cup left cooling untouched. People always assumed that locks kept things safe. They rarely considered how often the danger was invited in, politely, and given a place by the fire. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing Constable Wilkes's careful tracks as quickly as he made them, while inside sun. Mary Mead began, without quite realizing it, to measure itself against a stranger who had arrived quietly, unlocked a door no one expected to open, and died in a room that was not his own. By the following morning, the village had settled into a peculiar rhythm, one that Miss Marple recognized with weary familiarity. Outwardly, life continued as usual. Milk bottles appeared on doorsteps, curtains were twitched open at their proper hour, and the postman navigated the snow with stoic determination. Beneath it all, however, every action carried an undercurrent of anticipation. People smiled too readily. Questions lingered just behind polite remarks. Miss Marple, walking slowly toward the village shop, felt the weight of those unspoken thoughts pressing against her like damp wool. She had slept badly, not from excitement, but from the irritation of a detail that would not quite arrange itself. Arthur Bell, solicitor, London. A key, tea, poured and allowed to cool. It was not what was present that troubled her, but what was missing. At the shop, Mrs. Hartnell was already in full command of the counter, her chin lifted, with the quiet authority of a woman who knew she possessed information worth trading. She brightened when she saw Miss Marple. "Such dreadful business," she said, though her eyes gleamed. "Still, it's not every day something like that happens here." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "One hopes it won't become a habit." Mrs. Hartnell leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I heard he was here about money." "Oh?" Miss Marple selected a loaf with care. "From whom?" "Well, that's just it," Mrs. Hartnell said, delighted. "No one seems to know. But solicitors don't come all this way for fresh air, do they?" Miss Marple smiled. "Some people find the countryside restorative." Mrs. Hartnell dismissed this with a wave. "Not that sort. He was asking questions apparently last week." "Questions?" Miss Marple echoed gently. Mrs. Hartnell hesitated, as though realizing she might be giving too much away. "That's what Mrs. Pritchard said. He came into the shop, bought biscuits, asked about frozen cottage." Miss Marple felt a small, inward click, like a needle slipping into place. "How interesting." "Yes, well, I thought so," Mrs. Hartnell said, pleased. "I told him it was empty. Everyone knows that." "And did he seem surprised?" Mrs. Hartnell frowned, thinking back. "Not exactly. More disappointed." Outside, Miss Marple paused, letting the cold bite at her cheeks. Arthur Bell had been asking questions before his death. He had known the cottage was empty, or supposed to be, which meant he had not come by chance. As she turned toward home, she saw Constable Wilkes struggling with a clipboard. Near the green, his pencil refusing to cooperate with frozen fingers. He nodded when he saw her. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning," she said kindly. "Terrible weather for paperwork," he laughed, grateful. "Sergeant Graves says we must be thorough, everyone who might have seen him." "Quite right," Miss Marple said. She watched as he consulted his list. "You're speaking to Mrs. Dane today, I believe." Wilkes looked up sharply. "How did you know?" "Oh, she mentioned she'd been expecting you," Miss Marple said lightly. "She's very conscientious." The constable hesitated. She did see him, apparently. Spoke with him near the post office. Yes, Miss Marple murmured. I thought she might have. Wilkes blinked, but before he could ask more, Sergeant Graves appeared, his coat collar turned up, his expression already set in lines of impatience. Miss Marple, he said, if you remember anything else from yesterday, do let us know. Of course, she replied, though I'm sure you'll find I remember very little of consequence. Graves gave a non-committal grunt and moved on. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the way his boots crunched decisively through the snow, unconcerned with neatness. Men like Graves preferred solid facts. They distrusted impression. At home, she laid out her knitting but did not pick it up at once. Instead, she poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching Mrs. Dane cross the lane. Mrs. Dane walked carefully, as though each step required deliberation. Her gloved hands were clasped together, rubbing slightly, then stilling, then rubbing again. Miss Marple had seen that gesture before in other women in other circumstances. It was not guilt, precisely. It was pressure. When Mrs. Dane reached her gate, she paused, glanced back toward Frozen Cottage, then continued inside. Miss Marple's gaze followed her until the door closed. Arthur Bell had come to St. Mary Mead with purpose. He had a key, which suggested permission, or at least expectation. He had poured tea, which suggested company, and yet no one admitted to having invited him. The villagers spoke of burglars and accidents, but Miss Marple suspected something far quieter and far more dangerous. Unfinished business. That afternoon the snow eased, revealing patches of dark earth beneath. Tracks began to emerge, not fresh ones, but impressions half hidden, distorted by thaw. Miss Marple noticed how people's eyes were drawn to the ground now, as though answers might rise up through the slush. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement reported that Sergeant Graves had been asking about old property records. Apparently Frozen Cottage changed hands years ago. Complicated business. Most property is, Miss Marple said. It tends to collect history. Mrs. Clement sighed. I can't imagine anyone wanting to reopen it. Such a sad little place. Miss Marple said nothing. Sadness was often a disguise. People returned to places not because they were happy, but because they were unfinished. As dusk fell, a thin light glowed once more in the windows of Frozen Cottage. It was only the police continuing their work, but the effect was unsettling. The cottage looked almost occupied again, as though it resented being called empty. Miss Marple watched from her chair, knitting now with steady rhythm. Somewhere in the village, truths were being disturbed, much like the snow that had seemed so smooth and untouched the day before. And as always, it would not be the loudest voices or the most obvious movements that mattered most, but the small human habits who rubbed their hands together, who avoided a glance, who remembered to make tea for a guest they claimed not to have expected at all. By the fourth day, certainty had begun to harden in the village like frost that refused to melt. The initial shock had worn away, leaving behind something sharper, opinion. Miss Marple sensed it in the way greetings were exchanged too brisk, too bright, and in how conversation stopped half a second too late when she entered a room. People were no longer merely curious, they were invested. Sergeant Graves had settled into the spare room at the Crown Inn, turning its small sitting area into a makeshift office. Papers were stacked with increasing severity, and Constable Wilkes moved in and out with the anxious energy of someone desperate to be useful. Names were being circled now, not just noted. Mrs. Dane's name, Miss Marple suspected, was among them. She encountered Mrs. Dane that afternoon near the post office. The woman was standing very straight, as though posture alone might serve as a defense. Her gloves were off despite the cold, and her fingers worked at each other absently. Rub, check, wipe, before she seemed to realize she was doing it and forced her hand still. Miss Marple, she said quickly, too quickly. Cold weather we're having. Yes, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. It does make one aware of one's circulation. Mrs. Dane laughed, a brittle sound. Indeed, I've just been speaking to the police again. Such a nuisance, I'm sure, Miss Marple said. Though they're only doing their duty, Mrs. Dane nodded. They asked me about Mr. Bell. Arthur Bell. She pronounced the name carefully, as though it were a fragile object. I told them exactly what I told them before. I saw him once. He asked about the cottage. That's all. Of course, Miss Marple said. And you hadn't met him previously? Mrs. Dane's fingers twitched, rubbed together once, then stopped. No. Miss Marple smiled gently. How fortunate, then, that you remembered him so clearly. Mrs. Dane flushed. Well, one notices strangers. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. One does. They parted shortly after, Mrs. Dane walking away with deliberate composure. Miss Marple watched her go, noting how she did not look back this time. That too was a choice. Later, at the Crown Inn, conversation had turned speculative in a way that felt almost rehearsed. Mrs. Pritchard held forth near the fireplace, her voice pitched to Carrie. I always said Mrs. Dane kept herself to herself, she declared. You never know with people like that, so quiet, so private. Mrs. Bantry nodded. And she was seen talking to him. That's been confirmed. More than talking, if you ask me, Mrs. Pritchard said darkly. Why else would he have a key? Miss Marple sipped her sherry, her expression mild. She wondered, not for the first time, how readily people mistook privacy for secrecy and secrecy for guilt. Dr. Haydock joined her, lowering himself into the chair beside her with a weary sigh. There, circling her, he murmured. Yes, Miss Marple said. It's quite understandable, is it? He asked, glancing around. All they have is that she spoke to him, and that he had a key, hardly damning. No, Miss Marple said, but it is convenient. Haydock studied her face. You think it's too neat? I think, she said carefully, that when a village agrees too quickly, it is often agreeing about the wrong thing. That evening, Sergeant Graves paid Miss Marple a visit. He sat stiffly in her sitting room, declining tea at first, then accepting it after a moment's thought. His eyes moved over the shelves, the photographs, the orderly calm of the space. You've lived here a long time, he said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. Long enough to see many winters. And many people. People come and go, she said. Their habits are more consistent. Graves cleared his throat. You've been observant. Miss Marple smiled faintly. At my age, one has little else to do. He leaned forward. Mrs. Dane admits she spoke to Bell more than once. She now says he came to her house the day before he died. How interesting, Miss Marple said. She says he asked about property matters, old ones. Did he? Miss Marple asked. That's her story, Graves said, and she admits she was upset by the visit. Understandable, Miss Marple said. Solicitors have that effect. Graves frowned. You're not convinced. I don't doubt she was upset, Miss Marple said gently. I only wonder why. Graves exhaled. She had motive if there was a dispute. An opportunity. She lives closest. And yet, Miss Marple said, Frozen Cottage is closer still. He looked at her sharply. What do you mean by that? Only that places have memories, Miss Marple replied. And sometimes those memories invite people back, whether they wish to return or not. Graves stood. If you think of anything concrete, I shall let you know, Miss Marple said. After he left, she sat for a long time by the fire, knitting slowly. Her thoughts returned to the cottage, the boots by the wall, the wiped doormat, the poured tea. She thought of Mrs. Dane's rubbed hands, of her careful phrasing, of the way the village had seized upon her as an answer. The next morning brought news that seemed to confirm everything the villagers had already decided. Sergeant Graves announced that Mrs. Dane would be formally questioned again and perhaps detained. The word spread with alarming speed, accompanied by nods of satisfaction. Miss Marple listened to it all with quiet concern. She had seen this before too, the relief that came with believing the puzzle solved, even when too many pieces were still unaccounted for. From her window, she could see Frozen Cottage in the pale morning light. The police tape fluttered weakly at the gate, and beyond it the door stood, closed, unremarkable, as though nothing at all had happened there. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Somewhere in the village, a truth was being overlooked, not because it was hidden, but because it was inconvenient, and she suspected, with a growing certainty, that Mrs. Dane's rubbed hands were not those of a murderer, but of someone afraid that a very old secret was being dragged, inch by inch, back into the cold. The decision to detain Mrs. Dane did not come with drama, only with a quiet officialness that made it more unsettling. A police car appeared outside her cottage just after luncheon, its presence announced, less by sound than by the way people paused in mid-step to watch it. Curtains lifted an inch. Conversations faltered, then resumed in lowered tones. Miss Marple heard of it, from Mrs. Clement, who arrived breathless, cheeks pink with the cold and the thrill of importance. "They've taken her in for further questioning," she said, settling herself by the fire. "Only routine, Sergeant Graves says, but still, Miss Marple echoed softly. "She looked dreadful," Mrs. Clement continued. "Quite composed, of course, but one could tell." "Poor thing." Miss Marple nodded. She imagined Mrs. Dane standing very straight, her hands clasped to keep them still, answering questions with care. Not the posture of guilt, she thought, but of endurance. That afternoon, Miss Marple wrapped herself warmly and walked slowly toward Frozen Cottage. The lane was slushy now. The snow reduced to grey ridges at the edges, and the gate stood ajar where the police had passed through. She did not cross the tape, but she paused there looking. The cottage appeared smaller without its secrecy, like a shell washed clean by tide. Miss Marple's eyes traced the familiar details, the uneven roofline, the narrow windows, the stubborn chimney. It had been empty, yes, but not forgotten. Houses rarely were. Miss Marple? She turned to find Mr. Linton, the estate agent, puffing slightly from the walk. He removed his hat, looking faintly embarrassed. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I might say the same," Miss Marple replied pleasantly. He shifted his weight. "Sergeant Graves wanted some old files about the cottage." "Of course," she said. "There's been some confusion about keys." Linton grimaced. "That's putting it mildly. Officially, there should only have been one, mine." "And unofficially?" Miss Marple asked. He hesitated. "Well, years ago the previous owner kept a spare. Old habits die hard. People don't like to be locked out of their own past." Miss Marple looked at him sharply. "Who was the previous owner?" Mrs. Calder. "Linton said. Before my time, really. Died, must be 20 years now." "Did she have family?" "Not that anyone knew of," Linton replied. "Though there were rumors. There always are," Miss Marple said gently. "Did she leave the cottage to anyone?" Linton frowned. "No. Sold it before she died. Needed money, apparently. After that it passed through a few hands, none of them staying long." "And Mrs. Dane?" Miss Marple asked. "Did she live here then?" Linton shook his head. "No, she came to the village later, rented first, then bought her place." Miss Marple thanked him and watched as he continued on his way, his boots leaving shallow impressions that filled with water almost at once. Keys, she thought, rumors, money. It was all very familiar. That evening Sergeant Graves came again, his manner less assured than before. He accepted tea without hesitation this time. "We've searched Mrs. Dane's house," he said. "Found nothing incriminating. I'm glad to hear it," Miss Marple replied. "She admits knowing Belle longer than she first said," Graves went on. "He handled a matter for her years ago. A will." "Ah," Miss Marple said. "That can be upsetting." "It was changed," Graves said. "Mrs. Calder's will, Mrs. Dane was a witness." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And perhaps a beneficiary?" "No," Graves said. "But Belle was asking questions about the circumstances. Then he came here," Miss Marple said. "To Frozen Cottage?" "Yes," Graves said. "Mrs. Dane says she didn't know why." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "Did you ask her about the key?" Graves frowned. "She says she never had one." "People often forget such things," Miss Marple said mildly, "especially when they remind them of uncomfortable times." Graves sighed. "You think she's hiding something?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that she's hiding something she believes is shameful, not criminal." Graves looked unconvinced. "Then who invited Belle?" "Who poured the tea?" Miss Marple set her cup down. "Who still had reason to return to that cottage," she said. "Who felt entitled to be there." Graves stared at her. "You're suggesting the cottage itself is the key?" "In a manner of speaking," Miss Marple replied. Houses collect secrets. Sometimes they wait patiently for the right moment to release them. After he left, Miss Marple sat quietly, the room settling around her. Outside, the sky darkened early, and the village lights flickered on one by one. Somewhere, Mrs. Dane sat in a police room, hands folded, waiting. Miss Marple thought of Arthur Bell, arriving with confidence, unlocking a door, making tea. He had not been afraid. That troubled her. The following morning brought a small but telling development. Constable Wilkes stopped by with a message, his face earnest. "Sergeant Graves wanted you to know. We found another teacup in the cupboard at Frozen Cottage, matching the saucer that wasn't broken." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "How very tidy of someone." Wilkes blinked. "Yes, miss." After he left, Miss Marple picked up her knitting at last. 2 cups, she thought. One broken, one carefully put away. Someone had been there after the tea was poured. Someone calm enough to clean, to straighten, to leave the scene looking almost accidental. And that someone, she suspected, was not Mrs. Dane at all, but a person the village had not yet thought to look at too closely, because doing so would mean admitting that the past had not stayed buried, and that Frozen Cottage had never truly been empty. The thaw came suddenly, as Torbulus often did, transforming the village lane into narrow rivers and uncovering what the snow had so carefully concealed. Miss Marple noticed the change at once. People walked differently when the ground softened less confidently. Eyes down, minds attentive to what might surface. By mid-morning, Sergeant Graves had called an informal gathering at the Crown Inn. Not an announcement, exactly just a request for anyone with knowledge of Frozen Cottage's history to come forward. The request itself carried a faint note of irritation, as though Graves resented having to ask questions that did not fit neatly into his ledger. Miss Marple arrived quietly and took a seat near the window. She had learned that windows were useful. People spoke more freely when they believed their attention was elsewhere. Mr. Linton was there again, shifting uncomfortably. Mrs. Bantry sat stiff-backed, her lips pressed together in anticipation. Dr. Haydock leaned against the mantel, arms folded, his expression thoughtful rather than excited. And at the far end, almost hidden behind a potted plant, sat Mr. Fowler, the caretaker, who had once been employed on and off to keep an eye on properties no one quite wanted. Graves cleared his throat. "We're establishing a timeline," he said. "Specifically, who had access to the cottage over the past few years." "Access?" Mrs. Bantry echoed, but it was empty. Graves fixed her with a look. "Empty doesn't mean untouched." There was a pause, during which several people seemed to examine their hands. Miss Marple watched Mr. Fowler closely. He was rubbing his thumb along the edge of his cap, rub, check, wipe, before catching himself and folding his hands in his lap. "You maintained the place at one time," Graves said to him. "Yes, sir," Fowler replied, "years back, before Mrs. Calder sold it, and after occasionally," Fowler said. "If someone asked." "Who asked?" Graves pressed. Fowler hesitated. "Different people, estate agents. Once or twice, Mrs. Calder herself. But she sold it," Graves said. "She never stopped thinking of it as hers," Fowler replied quietly. Miss Marple felt a gentle tightening behind her eyes. Ownership, she knew, was not always a matter of deeds. Dr. Haydock spoke up. "Mrs. Calder was a private woman." "That's one way of putting it," Mrs. Bantry said. "People said she'd had trouble. Family trouble." Graves looked sharply at her. "What sort of trouble?" Mrs. Bantry hesitated, then shrugged. "A child, some said, long ago." The room stilled. Miss Marple did not look surprised. She had been waiting for that word to appear, like a submerged stone finally revealed by receding water. "Rumors," Graves said curtly. Of course, Mrs. Bantry replied too quickly. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Children have a way of refusing to remain rumors," she said gently. Several heads turned toward her. Mr. Fowler swallowed. "I only ever saw one visitor she didn't send away," he said suddenly. "A young woman. Came a few times, years back. Never stayed long." Graves straightened. "Name?" Fowler shook his head. "Mrs. Calder never introduced her." Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Dane, her careful posture, her rubbed hands, her fear of exposure rather than punishment. She thought of Arthur Bell, solicitor, arriving with confidence and a key, And after Mrs. Calder died? Graves asked. Fowler hesitated again. The young woman came once more. After the funeral, did she go inside? Graves demanded. Yes, Fowler said. She had a key. The word landed heavily. Mrs. Dane, Mrs. Bantry breathed. Graves looked satisfied. That confirms, but Fowler interrupted, voice trembling. She gave the key back. Left it on the table. Said she didn't want it anymore. Miss Marple watched Graves's certainty waver just slightly. Did anyone else ever have a key? She asked softly. Fowler glanced at her, then nodded. Mrs. Calder's nephew. Or so he said. Came once. Angry sort. Mrs. Calder wouldn't see him. A nephew? Graves snapped. Name? Didn't give one, Fowler said, but he said the cottage should have been his. The room buzzed with this new shape to the story. Miss Marple felt it settle, not as a solution, but as a widening of possibility. That evening she received a visit from Mrs. Dane, released at last, her composure worn thin by strain. She sat stiffly in Miss Marple's chair, hands folded with unnatural care. They think it was me, she said quietly. Some do, Miss Marple replied. Others are beginning to think again. Mrs. Dane's hands twitched, rubbed, check, wiped, then stilled. Arthur Bell came because he'd found something about Mrs. Calder, about the cottage. Yes, Miss Marple said. He said there was a claim. Someone else who might have had a right to it. He wanted me to confirm things I didn't want remembered. Because you were ashamed, Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Dane nodded, tears finally spilling. I was young. I did what I thought was best. And when he came to the cottage, I didn't meet him there, Mrs. Dane said. I told him not to. Miss Marple believed her. What troubled her was not what Mrs. Dane had done, but who had chosen to meet Arthur Bell instead. That night, Miss Marple lay awake, listening to the village settle. Somewhere, a truth was aligning itself not with noise, but with inevitability. A person who believed the cottage theirs. A person who felt wronged. A person calm enough to make tea, to clean up, to leave a scene tidy. In the soft dark, Miss Marple reached a quiet conclusion. Arthur Bell had not been lured to Frozen Cottage. He had been welcomed, and the person who welcomed him was still, even now, moving carefully through St. Mary Mead, trusting that old grievances would remain hidden just a little longer beneath the melting snow. The village responded to Mrs. Dane's release with a subtle shift in tone rather than relief. Certainty had been postponed, not abandoned, and people disliked being made to wait. Suspicion, deprived of its most convenient target, began to wander. Miss Marple noticed the change most keenly in small things, the way Mrs. Bantry's invitations grew more selective, the way Mr. Linton avoided eye contact when passing her gate, the way Mr. Fowler suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere when conversation turned toward the past. Guilt was not the only reason people withdrew. Fear worked just as effectively. She encountered Sergeant Graves again 2 days later, near the green where the thaw had left the grass mottled and slick. He looked tired now, the brisk confidence dulled by complications he had not anticipated. We're missing something, he admitted after a moment. Bell came here expecting cooperation. Instead, he ended up dead. That doesn't sit right. No, Miss Marple agreed. People who expect cooperation rarely prepare for violence. Graves glanced at her. You're very sure of that? I've watched people long enough, she said. When someone plans harm, they are usually tense. Mr. Bell, from all accounts, was not. Graves exhaled slowly. We've confirmed there was a dispute over ownership years ago. Mrs. Calder believed a relative had no claim. The relative believed otherwise, and belief, Miss Marple said gently, is often stronger than proof. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Mr. Fowler. His cottage lay at the edge of the village, modest and well kept, with a narrow path that showed signs of recent sweeping despite the damp. Order, she noted, could be a form of reassurance. He greeted her politely, if warily, and ushered her inside. The room smelled faintly of polish and old wood. Everything had its place. I won't keep you, Miss Marple said. I only wondered if you might help me understand something. Fowler's hands moved at once, rub, check, wipe, before he clasped them together. I've already told the police all I know, I'm sure, she said. But the police asked different questions. He swallowed. What do you want to know? You said Mrs. Calder's nephew came once, Miss Marple said. Angry. Insistent. Yes, Fowler said. That's right. And after that, he never came again, Fowler said quickly. Miss Marple smiled. Angry people rarely stop at once. Fowler looked away. I don't know what you mean. Of course not, she said kindly, but you did say someone continued to take an interest in the cottage. Quietly, Fowler's face tightened. I only kept an eye on it. That was my job. Was it? Miss Marple asked softly. Or did you feel responsible? He stared at her then, truly looked, and for a moment, the careful order of the room seemed to press in on him. I owed her, he said finally. Mrs. Calder, she helped me once, long ago. And the young woman? Miss Marple asked. Fowler shook his head. She didn't want trouble. She was frightened. Of being known, Miss Marple said. Yes, and the nephew, she continued. Fowler's hands rubbed together harder now, then stilled. He wasn't really her nephew. Miss Marple waited. He was her son, Fowler said, the words forced out. She never acknowledged him, gave him money instead, paid him to stay away. And he did not stay away, Miss Marple said. No, Fowler whispered. He came back. Years later, after she died. He believed the cottage was his by right. Miss Marple thought of Arthur Bell, solicitor, asking questions, carrying papers, arriving with a key and confidence. And Bell found him, she said. Yes, Fowler said hoarsely. Found the truth. Found the claim. Did you know Arthur Bell? Miss Marple asked. Fowler nodded. He came to me first. Asked if I'd seen Mrs. Calder's son. And you told him, Miss Marple said. I thought it was harmless, Fowler said desperately. Just papers, just words. Words can be very dangerous, Miss Marple said gently. Silence filled the room, heavy with understanding. Miss Marple rose at last. One more thing, she said. The day Mr. Bell died, did you see anyone go to Frozen Cottage? Fowler hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded. I saw him, he said. The sun, early, before the snow really set in, and afterward. No, Fowler said. Only the police. Miss Marple thanked him and left, the damp air cool against her face. The pieces were aligning now, not with the neatness the village desired, but with the messy persistence of human resentment. That evening she sat by her fire, knitting slowly, each stitch deliberate. The picture was clear enough to her now. A man who believed himself wronged. A house he believed was his. A solicitor who arrived to formalize what had been denied for decades. Arthur Bell had come with authority. He had unlocked the door. He had made tea. The son had come with anger. And anger, Miss Marple knew, did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waited until a man was seated, unguarded, convinced of his own safety. She laid her knitting aside and closed her eyes briefly. There was still one thing to be done. The truth, once uncovered, had to be coaxed into the open, not forced. People clung desperately to the stories that justify them. And so Miss Marple began to plan not an accusation, not a confrontation, but a small, carefully placed test. One that would rely, as all good tests did, on a simple principle of human nature, that those who believed themselves unseen were the most likely to reveal who they truly were. Miss Marple chose the moment carefully. She had learned that timing, like seasoning, mattered more than quantity. Too early and people dismissed you as meddlesome. Too late and they hardened themselves against truth. The opportunity came in the form of a small notice pinned to the board outside the village shop. Property records consultation, Crown Inn, Thursday afternoon. Sergeant Graves had arranged it, hoping to flush out lingering claims or forgotten grievances before the matter grew any colder. The notice attracted attention immediately. Property, after all, was never just property. It was memory entitlement proof. Miss Marple attended, as did most of the village. She seated herself near the back, knitting in hand, her presence so habitual it barely registered. Sergeant Graves stood at the front with Mr. Linton, folders spread across a table, explaining deeds and dates in a tone meant to discourage emotion. It did not succeed. Several villagers spoke minor questions, old misunderstandings, until at last a man Miss Marple had been expecting stepped forward from the edge of the room. His name officially was Thomas Calder. He was taller than his mother had been, broader in the shoulders, with the same dark eyes that Arthur Bell had possessed. The resemblance had not been remarked upon openly, but Miss Marple had noticed it at once. He dressed plainly, but not poorly, and his hands large, capable, were held very still at his sides. "I believe there's been an error," he said, his voice steady. "Regarding Frozen Cottage." The room hushed. Mr. Linton adjusted his glasses. "On what grounds, Mr. Calder?" Thomas's jaw tightened. "I was told the matter was unresolved, that I might have a claim." "A claim?" Mrs. Bantry murmured loudly. "Yes," Thomas said, eyes flicking toward her and then away. "Through my mother. There it was." Spoken aloud, it changed the air. Miss Marple watched his hands closely. They did not rub or fidget. They were controlled, too controlled. Mr. Linton cleared his throat. Arthur Bell was examining that possibility. "I know," Thomas said, "and yet," Sergeant Graves said carefully, "Mr. Bell is no longer able to clarify his findings." A flicker passed over Thomas's face, quick, almost imperceptible. Not grief, not surprise, relief, perhaps, or calculation. Miss Marple's needles paused for half a second. "How unfortunate," Thomas said. He was very thorough. "Yes," Miss Marple said mildly before she could stop herself. Several heads turned toward her, then away again. Old women were allowed their comments. Graves glanced at Thomas. "You were aware Mr. Bell intended to meet someone at the cottage?" Thomas hesitated, just a fraction. "I knew he planned to visit it. Did he expect you?" Graves asked. Thomas's lips pressed together. He didn't say. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "Solicitors usually do," she said gently. "They dislike surprises." Thomas looked at her for the first time. His gaze was sharp, assessing. "Perhaps he assumed I would come." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed. "Assumptions can be dangerous." The meeting ended soon after, the atmosphere unsettled, conversations buzzing low and urgent. Thomas Calder left quickly, declining tea, declining company. Miss Marple watched him go, noting how he avoided the center of the room, how he did not look back. That evening Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to Sergeant Graves. "I believe," she said once they were seated, "that Mr. Calder will return to Frozen Cottage." Graves frowned. "It's sealed." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but not in his mind." Graves studied her. "You think he can't resist it?" "I think," she replied, "that people who believe something was taken from them are compelled to revisit the place of injury, especially when they think no one is watching." Graves was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "We'll keep an eye on it." They did more than that. The next afternoon, when the light was already thinning, Constable Wilkes took a position near the lane, hidden just enough to observe without being obvious. Miss Marple, for her part, remained at home, her window providing a clear view of the path leading toward the cottage. The village seemed to hold its breath. Thomas Calder appeared just before dusk. He walked quickly, decisively, his coat collar turned up. He carried no bag. He did not look around. Miss Marple felt a familiar tightening, not triumph, but sorrow. It was always sad, she thought, when people walked willingly into the proof of who they were. At the cottage gate, Thomas paused. He hesitated only a moment before reaching into his pocket. The key fit. Inside, he moved with familiarity, not caution. He did not turn on all the lights, only the lamp by the table. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the hearth, at the place where Arthur Bell had lain. Miss Marple watched through the glass as best she could. She could not hear, but she could see enough. Thomas bent, opened a cupboard, removed the second teacup. He held it very carefully. When Sergeant Graves and Constable Wilkes entered moments later, their footsteps firm, their presence undeniable, Thomas did not startle. He closed his eyes instead, just briefly, as though acknowledging something inevitable. "I only wanted to see it again," he said quietly. Graves gestured toward the cup. "And that?" Thomas swallowed. His hands moved at last, rubbed, checked, wiped, then stilled. "I cleaned up," he said. After, Miss Marple arrived a few minutes later, leaning lightly on her stick, her expression kind. "You see," she said softly, "you were never angry enough to destroy the place, only to correct it." Thomas looked at her, and for the first time, Something like anguish broke through. "He told me it was mine," he said hoarsely, "that it would finally be set right. And when he told you how long it would take," Miss Marple said, "how many forms, how many delays, I lost patience." Thomas whispered. "Yes," she said, "you did." The truth settled into the room, heavy but complete. Thomas Calder had struck Arthur Bell in a moment of restrained fury, panicked afterward, then cleaned the scene just enough to suggest accident, believing the snow would do the rest. As Thomas was led away, Miss Marple stood quietly by the door, just as she knew was rarely dramatic. It arrived more often like this, tired, unavoidable, and tinged with regret. Outside, the village lights glowed steadily, unaware that the final shape of the mystery had at last revealed itself. The formalities moved forward with a subdued efficiency that felt almost merciful. Thomas Calder was taken away without spectacle, his coat folded over his arm, his head slightly bowed, not in shame exactly, but in the weary recognition that the struggle he had carried for years was finally over. The village watched him go from behind lace curtains and half-open doors, their curiosity now tempered by a faint discomfort. It was one thing to speculate about a murder in the abstract, quite another to see him walk past the butcher's shop and the post box, undeniably human. In the days that followed, St. Mary Mead behaved as villages always did after a crisis. It cleaned. Not just surfaces, but stories. Conversations were revised, opinions softened, certainty redistributed so that no one felt quite so responsible for having been wrong. Mrs. Dane returned to her routines with visible relief, though the lines around her mouth remained deeper. She passed Miss Marple one morning near the green and stopped, her hand moving unconsciously. Rub, check, wipe, before she caught herself. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "There's no need," Miss Marple replied. "You told the truth when it mattered. That is usually enough." Mrs. Dane hesitated. "He was her son, you know." "Mrs. Calder's." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently, "I know. I never meant to hurt anyone," Mrs. Dane said. "I only wanted it all to stay quiet." "Quietness," Miss Marple said, "is a very natural wish. It's just not always granted." Mrs. Dane nodded, accepting this, and moved on. Miss Marple watched her go with a mixture of sympathy and understanding. People so often mistook silence for safety. At the Crown Inn, Sergeant Graves sat with a stack of papers and a cup of tea that had gone cold. Miss Marple joined him uninvited, as she so often did. "You were right," he said without preamble, "about patience, about people." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It's not a matter of being right, only of paying attention." Graves rubbed his temple. "He didn't plan to kill Bell. That's the worst of it." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "He planned to claim something. Violence crept in when the claim felt threatened. He struck him once," Graves said quietly. "Panicked. Cleaned up. Thought the snow would protect him." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Snow can feel very forgiving." Graves looked at her sharply. "You knew he'd come back." "I hoped he would," she said. "People return to places where they believe the truth lives." "And the tea?" Graves asked. "The second cup." "A habit," Miss Marple replied. "He'd been there before. The cottage felt like home to him, in a way. He tidied because that's what people do in places they believe belong to them." Graves nodded slowly. "We nearly lost the thread. If it weren't for you, if it weren't for human nature." Miss Marple corrected gently. "I only recognized what I've seen before." Later that afternoon, she walked once more down the lane to Frozen Cottage. The police tape had been removed. The door was locked again, properly this time, and the windows reflected the pale winter sky. It looked ordinary now, almost dull, which was perhaps the greatest kindness that could be offered to it. Miss Marple paused at the gate. She did not go in. There was nothing left for her there. She thought of Arthur Bell arriving with confidence and papers neatly arranged. He had believed in process, in order, in time. He had underestimated how unbearable waiting could be to someone who had already waited a lifetime. Back in the village, the chatter had begun to soften. Mrs. Bantry now spoke of the affair with regret rather than triumph. Mrs. Pritchard insisted she had always felt it was something to do with old-fashioned business, though Miss Marple recalled her earlier certainty with precision. At the vicarage, Mrs. Clement remarked, "It's all terribly sad when you think of it." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "most things are, if one thinks long enough." That evening she sat by her fire with her knitting, the familiar rhythm steadying her thoughts. The case had resolved itself, as these things often did, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. The village would recover. It always did. What lingered was not fear, but the faint unease of knowing that quiet places held deep currents. Miss Marple laid her knitting aside and looked into the fire. Human beings, she reflected, were endlessly consistent in their inconsistencies. They hid what they were ashamed of, clung to what they believed owed to them, and acted most dangerously when convinced they were finally about to be set right. Outside, the last of the snow had melted away, leaving the ground dark and honest. Merry Mead settled into its evening calm, lamps glowing, doors closing gently, secrets rearranged but not erased. And Miss Marple, composed as ever, allowed herself a small, thoughtful sigh, content not with the outcome, but with the understanding that, once again, human nature had explained everything that facts alone could not. The village did not speak of Frozen Cottage for a time, not directly. Its name faded from conversation in the way sore teeth fade from the tongue carefully avoided, but always present. Life resumed its expected shape. Deliveries arrived. The church bells rang on Sunday with their familiar, reassuring insistence, and yet something had shifted, subtle but undeniable, like a picture rehung a fraction too low. Miss Marple noticed it most in the silences. A week after Thomas Calder's departure, she received a letter from London, its handwriting precise, the tone dutiful. It informed her unnecessarily that Arthur Bell's affairs were being concluded, his papers reassigned, his professional life reduced to a neat administrative end. There was no mention of Frozen Cottage, no acknowledgement of tea poured or words spoken by a cold hearth. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with others like it. The world, she knew, preferred its tragedies tidied. She walked that afternoon, as she always did, along the lane past the cottage. The gate was closed now. A new lock gleamed faintly, efficient and impersonal. The windows were shuttered, the chimney dark. It looked smaller than ever, diminished by exposure, like a truth once dragged into daylight. Miss Marple paused only briefly. She felt no need to linger. Places that had finished speaking deserved rest. In the village, adjustments continued. Mrs. Dane attended church again, sitting near the aisle, her posture still careful but no longer rigid. The habit of rubbing her hands returned only occasionally now, and when it did, she noticed it herself and smiled faintly, as though forgiving her own nerves. She no longer avoided Miss Marple's gaze. Mrs. Bantry, by contrast, became effusively kind, pressing invitations with exaggerated warmth. She spoke of the affair as a cautionary tale, her own certainty conveniently softened by hindsight. Mrs. Pritchard, having lost her starring role, redirected her attentions to the weather and the price of preserve, though she still began sentences with, "Well, when all that trouble happened," before catching herself. Sergeant Graves departed soon after, his work concluded, his respect for the village permanently altered. He came to say goodbye on a pale morning, hat in hand. "I don't suppose St. Mary Mead will ever feel quite the same to me," he said. "It rarely does," Miss Marple replied. "Once you've seen behind a curtain." He hesitated. "I've learned something, though, about listening." "Yes," she said, "it's a useful skill." After he left, Miss Marple returned to her sitting room, settled by the window, and resumed her knitting. The needles moved smoothly now, no pauses, no miscounts. Her thoughts, too, had found their proper order. She thought of Thomas Calder not with anger, but with a kind of melancholy understanding. A man raised on absence, promised nothing openly, offered compensation instead of acknowledgement. He had grown into his grievance the way others grew into traditions, until it shaped him entirely. When Arthur Bell arrived with proof and procedure, it had felt, to Thomas, like yet another postponement, another polite refusal of something he believed was owed. Violence, Miss Marple reflected, was often born not of hatred but of impatience. She also thought of Mrs. Calder long dead, whose choices had echoed far beyond her lifetime. Respectability, silence, fear of judgment, how many tragedies had those quiet forces shaped? And how often did people imagine that by not speaking, they were preventing harm when in fact they were only delaying it? The fire crackled softly. Outside, a child's laughter drifted down the lane, bright and unburdened. Life mercifully continued. That evening, the vicar came by with his wife, bringing biscuits and a vague air of relief. Conversation touched on safe topics, repairs, charitable events, the upcoming change in seasons, before Mrs. Clement, hesitating, said, "I suppose we'll all remember this for a long time." "Yes," Miss Marple said, though not always accurately. They laughed, a little self-consciously, and soon departed. Miss Marple remained by the fire, the room settling into its familiar hush. As the light faded, she considered the pattern she had seen repeat so many times. In villages and families and friendships alike, people believed themselves ordinary, harmless, incapable of great harm, and most of the time they were. But place them under the right pressure, deny them acknowledgement, force them to wait endlessly for justice, and even the most restrained among them might strike out, convinced of their own righteousness. Human nature, she reflected, did not require monsters. It required only people who felt unseen. She set her knitting aside and closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the quiet of St. Mary Mead. The village had returned to its gentle rhythms, but it would never again be quite as innocent, nor should it be. Innocence, after all, was not the same as goodness. Outside, the lane lay empty, the cottage distant and dark, its secrets spent at last. Inside, Miss Marple sat composed and thoughtful, content not because just had been done, though it had, but because understanding had followed, and that, she knew, was the truest resolution any mystery could offer.